Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining. We're about to get started. I wanted to let everyone know before we start that the slides for this event and a recording will be available afterwards. And I also wanted to call attention to the blog that IAE runs at by.gsa.gov at Interact. And you can also find a link to that on sam.gov in the footer if you select community. Salome, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those of you on the left coast. My name is Salome Gorbani, and I'm the director of the Outreach and Stakeholder Engagement Division here at the IAE. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for taking an hour out of your day. We wanted to reach out to the folks that we consider to be our force multipliers, the folks who are working hands-on with businesses that are going to be most impacted by the changes that Michael is going to be showing you. Make sure to use the Q&A pod for questions, and I'll be tracking the questions, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. And without any further ado, I would like to turn this over to Michael Towery, who is the product owner for these specific changes that he is going to demonstrate. So Michael, all yours.
Thanks, Salome. Looks like my microphone's working. Okay. My name is Michael Towery. I'm a product owner with GSA. So let's get started on the agenda. I think we're hopeful this won't take the full hour, so we'll have some time to answer some of the questions at the end. I know that we have a couple of people trying to answer questions as I go through it. So if you have any questions, go ahead and use the Q&A tool as it mentions on each of the slides here. So agenda, the welcome and housekeeping, what is entity validation, what's changing, overview of the new process. We'll do a walkthrough where we have some screenshots kind of replicating what a demo would look like, and then a Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. Keep going. Okay, so what is entity validation? For those who might not be too familiar with this, the entity validation is a process used to verify users' entity against an external data source to prevent fraud and ensure sam.gov has the correct entity information. When a user attempts entity validation and their entity is either not found or is incorrect in the entity validation service database, they create an entity validation ticket. They upload documentation, and that's to represent their correct information. So this process essentially is making sure that the SAM entity data is valid. It's checked against a third or sort of a separate system and an independent system. So trying to make sure that everything in SAM is correct and up to date. Next slide, please. So what we're really focusing on here is this new process for entity validation tickets. So this is specific to the EVS tickets, as I'll refer to them. So we're changing the way users respond in SAM after the entity validation agent makes updates that the user has requested. Users told us the current process is confusing and it can lead to mistakes. This change only affects users who submit entity validation tickets. Users who are renewing or already validated entities, or if they're not changing the entity name, not changing the doing business as, or the physical address, then they won't see this change. New users who find their correct entity data in the entity validation database will not see this change either. So there's a lot of entities that have already gone through validation. As long as nothing is changing for them, they won't actually see this precise change. They'll see something pretty similar to what we see at the screenshot on the screen there. Basically, this is what an entity that is already validated might see, and if their information is up to date, they would just select this is my entity's correct legal business name and address. But this is if they're going through validation. But basically, this information is correct, so they won't need to create a ticket. Next slide, please. So let me highlight what's changing. The current state, and this is sort of where we are now with the user having created an entity validation ticket, so they need to make some sort of change. So the user submits their entity validation documentation. They receive an email when the update is complete. They sign into sam.gov. And based on the instructions they receive after that EVS agent has completed the work, they restart the validation process. And then they review and accept each piece of information to complete validation. So that highlighted part, the restart the validation process, is where some users have given us feedback that that's not always the easiest thing to do. We've also found through looking at historical tickets that some users might make a different selection, or they might make a mistake during that process. So we're trying to simplify that step right there. So on the right-hand side, after July 19th, the user, they still submit entity validation documentation. They still receive an email when the update is completed by the EVS agent. The big change now, number 3, selects link from in the email to sign into SAM.gov. So with this change, we'll be providing a link to the user via email and via the FSD interface if they look at the ticket there. That link will take them directly into this new workflow that will allow them to review the changes and accept the changes if everything looks good. So then number 4, reviews and accepts each piece of information to complete the validation. So the key change is that we're trying to get the user into the process in a better way and remove some confusion from the process, remove some duplicate work for the user. We don't really need them to go through the search again. We can just have them confirm exactly what they requested and make sure everything looks good. So next slide, please. A quick diagram to show the overview of the process. So starting on the left, the user opens an EVS ticket. The next box to the right, EVS agent process. That's where the agent reviews the documentation the user submitted. They're looking to make sure that those documents are acceptable document types. They're looking for information in those documents and comparing it against what the user asked for, make sure that aligns and there's no discrepancies, so that document can be used to validate what the user is requesting. So then the EVS agent will process, the process will result with the EVS agent publishing a change to the entity data. The next step to the right, receive email with link. So the user gets the link in the email, click that link, navigate to SAM and sign in. And the next page takes them right to a review page that we'll look at in a moment, where the user will basically check and see all the information that the agent has updated is what they've requested. The decision point of whether or not it's correct or not. If it's not correct, then we go down and to the left to submit corrections. Sometimes the user may have overlooked one piece of information. Maybe they didn't add an address line too. It could be something the agent either missed or overlooked, or there could be even a typo. So there's an opportunity for the user to review the work done by the agent, make sure the information is correct before they move forward. If everything looks good, then they go to the right, get unique entity ID, or if they're in the midst of registration, they may go on to register the entity. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at a walkthrough. Next one. So once the user receives the email from the EVS agent, they will, in this case, either the user attempts entity validation, their entity is either not found or incorrect in the entity validation database. So if they don't find the entity at all, or if they found it, but there's some information that might be out of date or incorrect, then they would have created this ticket. So once the agent has completed the work and the user receives the email, the agent performs work, sends the email to the user. The email includes the link to confirm their entity information in SAM. Next slide, please. So this is a preview of what the user will see once this change goes in. So after the EVS agent publishes the changes, the user receives the email from the agent. The user will select the link from the email, sign into SAM.gov, and then they're immediately landing on this screen. So they'll select Review Entity Details button to review the changes. So it shows them in this screen basically what information is published by the agent. So it's the updated entity details, and then we'll walk the user through several screens to validate. Well, really, the user is validating that the change is what they wanted. So the the user is confirming each of the pieces of information. Next slide, please. So here we're going through sort of the happy path of everything that the user requested was updated by the agent and everything looks good. So they review each item and select yes to verify it. And then they'll select the next review button to move to the next item. So the two screenshots on the right, the first one of 5, is your legal business name correct? The user selects yes because it's correct. There's a note to the right about checking things like if suffixes like LLC or INC are on your documents, you must include them. So sometimes a user may request a change that doesn't align with the documentation. So just a warning there to let the user know that if they need to make a change, they really should be requesting a change that is supported by their documentation. The lower screenshot, 2 of 5, is you're doing business as correct. They said yes, that one looks good. And the other change here is the 1 of 5, 2 of 5, and so on. We're trying to give the user an indication of where they are in the process. That was some other feedback that we've received. Sometimes as you go through a multi-step process like this, you don't necessarily know how much more do I have to go and where am I in that process. And the buttons, they also give you a preview of what the next screen is going to ask you for. So let's go on to the next one. The next one just has the 3 additional, 3 of 5, 4 of 5, and 5 of 5. So they'll go through each of these steps, the physical address, the start year, which won't be on every entity record, and then the state of incorporation. Likewise, it's not on every entity record, but it is, if it is present, it's something that's used for validation. So in this case, the user has selected yes for each of these 3 items, confirming that the information is correct. And they've progressed down to this 5 of 5. So we'll go to the next screen. So now they get to a summary page. Your legal entity gives a name, doing business as, the physical address, start year, state of incorporation. These are all pieces of information that were individually confirmed by the user. At this point, the unique entity ID is blank on this page because this is demonstrating an entity that has just come into SAM for the first time. They haven't previously received a UEI. So they would then click next on this screen. So next screen, or next slide, please. And that essentially would finish the entity validation portion. So when all items are verified, the request unique entity ID screen displays. That's what we see on the right. If the entity is already registered, the system displays the entity information. The user selects next to continue. There's a couple different options here depending on what they intended to do when they started. So in this case, we're looking at an entity that just needed to get a UEI assigned. So they're on this request unique entity ID. That essentially will end this workflow. They would click a button to receive the UEI. It would be displayed on the screen, and they'd essentially be done with that. If they needed to register, they could always do that later. They can go back to the workspace and select register from there. So this shows what we would consider the happy path of the user accepting all of the changes that the EVS agent has published. So let's take a look at what it might look like if they need to make a couple more updates. So next slide, please. So if the data is incorrect, in this example, the company name and address are incorrect after the EVS agent finishes their work. After receiving the email from the EVS agent, the user will select the link, sign into SAM, and then to make those changes, they'll select review entity details. So this looks similar to the start point we had before, but we'll make a few different selections as we go through this one. Next slide. So how does the user correct the data if they see something that isn't right? So we navigate through these screens again. In this case, we select no for any data that is incorrect. And in the first screenshot, 1 of 5 is your legal business name correct. When we select no, we get a text box where the user can enter what they want the legal business name to be. So again, this should align with the documentation that the user has. In this case, so if their entity had initially had Inc. or incorporated as part of their name, and they've since updated it to no longer have that, as long as they're able to document that, then this request is certainly going to be valid. The second screenshot is you're doing business as correct. In this case, there's no issue with that one, so they select yes, and they can move on from there. So next slide. So again, correcting data, additional verification screens. So 3 of 5 on the left, is your physical address correct? So when they say no, we're going to collect each piece of the physical address and let the user enter what they would like it to be. So in this case, we're essentially looking at an entity that has probably moved. So they've entered a street address 1 that is different from what was initially found in the entity validation service database. The zip code, the +4, the city, and the state are all the same. So we'll collect all the information. This will be passed over via the ticket to the EVS agent. They'll review it and match it up to the document that is attached by the user. So then the 2 screenshots on the right is your start year correct and is your state of incorporation correct. They selected yes for both of these, so no changes there. Those, according to the user, those were correct. So let's take a look at the next slide. So now we see a slightly different view at this final confirmation point. The previous entity details on the left, it shows the old physical street address, 123 Main Street. In either case, there's no street address 2. Everything else in the address is the same. So city, state, zip code, country, no changes there. Looking above, the entity name has been updated. So the INC is now removed. And on the right-hand side, the updated entity details shows the updated name and address. Start year, state of incorporation, no change there. So then it summarizes at the bottom, you're updating legal business name and street address 1. So these 2 fields will be things that the user will need to document. So we'll request documentation specifically for those. It doesn't necessarily have to be one document. It could be, in this case, it probably would be one document because they would be tying those 2 pieces of information together in a document, the legal business name and street address. But if it were something else like a start year or a state of incorporation, there are times where the articles of formation, they may not have an address, but if they do, that address might be out of date, and that's okay. If the legal business name connects the document to the requested information update, there can be multiple documents needed to validate. So the note on the left, on the reviewed entity details page, review the changes to ensure they are correct. If they are not, select previous to go back and fix them. So if you got to this point and realize, oh, I actually do have a suite number, so I need to add that to my street address too, you could just click the previous button, navigate back to the address, which is step 3 of 5, add the street address 2, and then proceed back through, come to this confirmation, make sure everything looks good, and then click next to continue. So next slide, please. So at this point, the user has documented, or I should say they've identified all of the information they want to update. And now we need to document, or actually attach documents to the EVS ticket in SAM. So to provide supporting documentation for your changes, select Add Document on the document in your entity details page. This pops up a small window, which you can see on the right. In the Add Document window, select the type of document and upload it. So the type of document might be some of the acceptable documents listed here. It could be, in this case, it might be a bank statement if they have a name and address that's updated. It could be utility bill less than 5 years. There's a list that's in that select document type. And there's also some help content on the screen that would help a user just decide what are acceptable documents. So once they've attached the document, identified what type of document it is, they also check a box to indicate what is contained within that, or what they're validating with that document. So in this case, there's really only one thing that's being checked. It's physical address. with legal business name and physical address in the same document. So they select that checkbox in the small window, upload the document, and then submit it. Once they've documented all of the requested changes, then they can submit this ticket. The comments section, even though it's optional, I would strongly advise anyone you talk to or work with to, put in a little message there just to say what you're requesting. The agents certainly could make a mistake, so if you can take a moment to call out anything that's, if it's a small typo or something that might be easy to miss, if it's a major change, that's okay too. Just describe what the change is and then submit the ticket. So the agent will be able to see those comments. Let's go to the next slide, please. So on the confirmation screen, you see on the right-hand side, documentation successfully submitted, and it'll show the reference number, which is the ticket number. So a number like INC-GSA FSD, and then about a 7 or 8 digit number. So that number can be found from the workspace. The user will also be receiving emails about that. So the EVS agent gets the documentation, reviews the new information. The documentation is sufficient. The agent accepts the document, publishes the changes requested by the user. So at this point, the user can click close and return to their workspace. Next slide, please. So there's another way for the users to access this workflow. So this might be if a user just logs into sam.gov and they navigate to their workspace, and then they'll see the screen on the lower right. So they sign into SAM, navigate to workspace, select entities under entity information. That entities link will take them to the workspace that shows these entities in more detail. So when they get to the workspace that shows that pending ID assignment record on the lower right, there's a note there about what they should do next. They have a pending update to your entity information. You must confirm your entity details are correct to finish validating your entity. So clicking that confirm button will bring up the same screen that we saw earlier, where they initially got to from the email, from the link provided in the email. So it's just another way to get to that same point. Anyone with a data entry or entity administrator role with the entity sees the confirm button in their entity's workspace and can complete the entity validation. So I think this is another common question we've heard. What if I'm the entity administrator? I've created this ticket, but I'm out of office next week. Can somebody else, pick up where I left off? So anyone who has a role to the entity, specifically data entry or entity administrator role, they will be able to go to the workspace. They'll see the ticket that the first user submitted. And once that ticket is completed by the EVS agent, they would get this confirm button. So this might also be a case where the first user who opened the ticket would get the email notification. The second user, who's the backup essentially, they might not necessarily get that email notification, but they can go back in and check the status in the workspace. They can see this confirm button, they can click that and go into that workflow where they go step by step through each piece of information, confirm everything is correct, and reach a point where they've validated the entity. The other thing not mentioned here specifically, there's also another role called viewer or data viewer. I think it's rarely used, but it does exist in SAM. If somebody has a viewer role, they would see the entity, they would see an entity in the workspace if it has a UEI assigned, but they wouldn't have this option of confirm, and they wouldn't see the alert, and they wouldn't see the ticket details. So really they only see the entity that exists. It's similar to a public search type of view. A viewer role doesn't have access to submit updates to a registration, for example. They can't delete a work in progress registration, and they can't update the name and address on an ID assigned record, which is a UEI only. So the viewer role literally is there so they can view the record. Let's go to the next slide. So what if a user doesn't respond right away? So in my previous scenario, if the administrator submitted a ticket and then went on vacation for 2 weeks and came back. What would have happened is that agent would have made those updates generally in about a day or two, maybe less, maybe more, but usually within 2 days, we should expect to see those updates made. So an email would have gone to the user with the link for them to go back in and confirm. If that user who receives the email or another administrator doesn't take any action, what happens is the ticket resolves after 5 days, and the changes made by the agent sort of automatically get published. So instead of having that review period where the user can go back in and say, no, something isn't quite right, what will happen is that those changes sort of get written to the entity validation database, and then the validation part is sort of put on hold until the user comes back, and they would see a screen like this. So if they return to their entity's workspace, they select update entity, continue their validation. They search the entity validation database like today, but instead of finding an out-of-date record or potentially a missing record, they would find their correct information. So it's very similar to what happens today. The only downside of missing that five-day window is just not having the step-by-step review screens. So they would click on update entity, this action button on the workspace, and go through the EVS search again, just like they would have done when they first started. Like I mentioned, they should find the exact match for their entity. They can select that and proceed through the steps to complete validation. So those steps include potentially providing the state of incorporation or date of incorporation. If the user had already submitted a ticket, presumably they either knew that data for validation purposes, or they may have had it updated as part of that ticket. Entity administrators who may be unavailable after submitting an EVS ticket can ask other users with roles to check their entity's workspace for updates. So that pretty much summarizes the update entity button. So this button appears after that 5-day period. And it's not necessarily it's not a problem if they don't come back to this within 5 days. It's just a slightly different experience. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about users who have open tickets when this change goes live? So it really depends on whether the EVS agent has already responded to the ticket. So this change is planned to go to production on July 19th. So if a user happens to open an EVS ticket, they're looking for their entity on July 18th. By July 19th, the agent may not have reviewed that ticket yet. So if the EVS agent has not sent changes to the user before deployment, the user will get the new experience when they resume validation. So then what would happen is the agent would sort of make these changes, publish the changes, and the user would get an email link to go to those screens that we showed before. If the EVS agent sends changes to a user before deployment, the user will get the current experience even if they resume validation after deployment. So what they would get is an email with a set of steps, similar to basically exactly what they would get today. They would get the steps to go back in, perform the entity search again. They would see the correct entity details. They would select that and go through validation. So it doesn't necessarily matter if they create a ticket right before this deployment or not. It just, they may still go through the old sort of researching their entity when they come back into SAM. Next slide, please. So I think we had a couple of questions. I haven't seen those. Let me turn it back to Meg or Salome. Is there anything that came up out of there that you wanted me to address?
Hi, Michael. Yeah, we're getting a few questions. And let's begin with, for those who are suspicious of clicking links in emails because of phishing and all the other fun security stuff going on. Will the full link be displayed so that it can be copy and pasted into the browser?
Yeah, so it shouldn't look like a click here text, which is then linked to something else. It'll be, I should have one of those in front of me. It'll have the sam.gov, and then it actually has the ticket number, incident number in the URL as well. So yeah, it should look familiar, and it is the full text of the link.
And can you confirm where the link takes them? Does it take them just to the main page or the workspace in SAM, or does it take them to the place where they needed to do the updates?
So if we go back to, let me check which slide that is. Yeah, so the way the link is going to work, probably more often than not, the user who gets this email, this EVS process is not, it's not a real-time process where they submit a ticket and then they're not going to get that email within the time it takes for their session to expire, or they might move on to something else. So the most common scenario is that the user gets this email and they're not currently logged into SAM, and they don't have an active session, active login session with SAM. So when they navigate to that link, it's going to take them through a screen that says, "You're not logged in, please sign in." You click on one of those sign in options and then sign into SAM. The site redirects to that link that they initially started on. So they don't have to go looking for the link again, and they don't get dumped into the sort of home screen or workspace and don't know where to go. So they should get redirected to the confirm entity details screen, which we're just showing sort of a snippet of it, but that's the majority of the screen on the right. So they shouldn't have to go looking for, where do I go, or which entity was I working on if they have multiple entities. It should take you directly to this page.
Great, thanks, Michael. There was a question to ask if you've confirmed that we've tested the link in the email to make sure that it works.
Yeah, the way we're testing it right now is the email. So the user once it's in production, they'll be able to see either from the FSD portal, if they check on the status of their ticket there, they'll be able to see the link there. That FSD portal also generates the email that goes to the user, which has the same text of the message that's available from FSD. So they'll get an email with the text of that message that contains the URL or the link. Don't know if that did answer.
Sorry, go ahead.
I wasn't sure if that answered the question, but basically, yeah, the link is available either from FSD or from the email that gets generated from the FSD incident.
And what happens if the user does not respond to the email? Does the validation just sit there indefinitely as in an incomplete status, or what happens there?
So if they essentially submit the ticket and don't do anything for, the example I had is over 5 days. Basically, there's a automatic process of moving tickets from. Once the agent has completed their work, if the agent has the ticket and is still working on it, then it could be indefinite, but that's not the usual case. What happens is the agent updates the information, and then the ticket status changes so that it's now essentially on hold waiting for the user to respond. If the user doesn't respond and it goes over 5 days, that ticket will close, and those changes that the EVS agent made will be published. Essentially, the user gives up the opportunity to go through those review steps that we showed earlier. And instead, what would happen is you would have the update entity button, and the user would go through an EVS search. They go through a search for their name and address, just like they did when they clicked on Get Started and started the whole process. So they would go through that search, and hopefully, since the EVS agent has already done the work of publishing the changes, the user would see the correct information returned in that search, and they'd be able to select that record and continue validation from there. However, if something got missed by the agent or the user forgot to request some change, if something's not right, then they essentially go through creating an EVS ticket again. So in the preferred path, the user is catching any mistakes or changes or additional needs that they have, and it all stays with the same ticket. The ticket is still, it's the same ticket, through the looping process of confirming all of those changes. If I say no, something isn't right, that I submit a document again, and that goes back to the agent under the same ticket. So it could be one ticket that has some back and forth with the agent and the user. If that 5-day period elapses where the user hasn't responded, then that ticket closes, and it just means they'll have to open a new ticket, and then they would see the same, once the EVS agent makes the changes the second time to the second ticket, the user would get the link, they would go into SAM, confirm all of those changes, and everything would be updated at that point.
Okay, next up is a question asking, once the entity submits the change via the link, do they get the associated FSD ticket number, or will that part of it no longer, is that part of it changing, basically?
So the ticket creation process still starts at SAM. So maybe I should clarify that it's not, by the time the user is getting a link to come back to SAM to review the changes, they've already submitted the ticket. They've already gone through the same process that we have today, which is you're either updating an existing entity or you're starting something new, and you search for that information in SAM. And it's only when you don't find a correct match that you end up creating a ticket. So at the end of that ticket creation process, you get the ticket number. It's displayed on screen. I think if we move ahead a few slides, I think it was there on. So this is similar to this. This is basically what it would look like. So the user goes through the steps of basically requesting what changes they want, submit documentation, and submit the ticket. They get the ticket number displayed on screen. They'll get an email through FSD as well. And then look at the question again, once the entity submits the change via the link. So then once they get the link is taking them back to SAM after the agent has made the updates. So the link is after the ticket creation initially happens. So by then the user should already know what the ticket number is, and they would have received an email from FSD that included that ticket number.
And there was a follow-up question, Michael. It says 5 days for the user to review and respond to the changes. Is that business days or calendar days?
I'm pretty sure it's calendar days. I think it's just a counter essentially from when the agent publishes the changes.
Okay, next up. On slide 16, there was some confusion around understanding after the EVS agent makes the corrections, is there an opportunity for additional corrections? Say, for example, the EVS agent, gets it wrong. If the entity manually enters the changes to the record and also provides matching support documentation, is that anticipated to happen?
Yeah, I'm looking at that question as well. If the entity manually enters, so yeah, there's certainly an opportunity for either side to make a mistake or to miss something. I don't want to say it's always going to be a mistake. It could just be a mistake being a typo, or it could be I omitted a change or an update that I meant to ask for as the user's point of view. So if we go to slide 17. So let me just review the question again. If the entity manually enters the changes to the record and also provides matching supporting docs. Yeah, so I think what what could happen and what does happen is there's some back and forth between the agent and the user today on some EVS tickets. Many tickets have no back and forth. The agent makes the changes, the user says, yep, looks good, and everything is fine. But the ones where there's back and forth, this process is aimed to help with that. So we're trying to get away from tickets getting closed out when there's still something needed to be done. We're also trying to get away from users having to describe what they want in the as a comment in the ticket, and instead essentially indicate it in this step-by-step process, so the agent knows what exactly to look for. Is, what did I miss if I missed something as the agent, or what is the user now asking for? I think one of my examples is the user sees everything that the agent updated and then realizes I didn't add my suite number, and then goes back in and says, no, my address is not actually correct. I need to add a suite number. And that's where I think it helps for the user to go and put a comment in the ticket when they get to the end of this and they add documentation. The comments are optional, but if they just put in a quick comment and say, needed to add address line 2 or needed to add a suite number, that gives a very clear indication to the agent of what are they actually looking for on that particular ticket. So this process does keep the ticket. It doesn't change how a ticket closes automatically, so that can happen today as well. But this gives a better back and forth experience for the user to indicate what it is that they need updated.
Thank you, Michael.
Oh, Salome, there's also the question I just saw about the at 1:13 p.m. will this cut back on the multiple validation tickets due to any not showing up?
I was just getting ready to ask you that one. Yes.
That's definitely what we're hoping is the benefit of this process. So one of the things that happens today is the agent makes an update and they might create a new record for the user to go look for, or they might update an existing one. But right now the user has to go back in and do that search again. So there's users who have multiple entities with similar information. There's users who might search an entity name or an address slightly different from when they first went in and searched it. They might get different results, or they might see a result that looks different from the one that they picked the first time through. So we're trying to cut out that search process because we know which EVS record needs to be reviewed by the user, and that's the one we're showing to them in this review process. We don't need them to search again and potentially make a mistake in selecting the entity. So yeah, that's definitely one of the things we're trying to improve with this. Is if it's an international entity and that that EVS record is being established for the first time, the link will take them directly to the confirmation steps. So it will show them the record that got created for them and have them verify that everything is correct. So it does take out that search step, and hopefully we'll have fewer issues with that step.
And if there's a problem with the documentation and the information during the validation, they're still going to get an email detailing this process, correct? And the remediation.
Yeah, I don't have an example of that in front of me, but there is a step where the agent either accepts or rejects the document. So that's something that the user will get communicated to them from the EVS agent via email, via the FSD ticket. And when they go in the workspace, I don't know if we have a screenshot showing, there's a button called Open Cases, which will show the EVS tickets in the workspace. So if a user goes and clicks on Open Cases, finds their ticket number in that list, there may only be one, and they click on I think it's Review Documents is the button. They basically click the button to open the detail of the ticket. They can see the accept and reject status of the individual documents that were attached. So for example, if they attached articles of formation, it got accepted, and they attached a lease agreement, and that got rejected, they'd be able to see which one got accepted, which one got rejected. So they might have a change that didn't get published or didn't get done because the document was not sufficient.
Okay, thank you. I am keeping an eye on the time, Michael, so we're just going to keep going. I've got one or two more questions on what you've shown, and then we have some general questions related to the validation process itself.
Okay.
And whatever, if you're not comfortable answering some of it, since you're very well in tune, but not living in the space, we've also got Ivana available who can help answer if needed. The next question is, what is considered a reasonable amount of time for the EVS agent to respond to a ticket? Will the administrator be notified of that amount of time to expect a response, and how to address any next steps if required, if that's what's necessary to continue through the process?
Jason, if you could go to the slide that shows the ticket, like where the ticket number is confirmed. I want to see what the messaging was there. So we at least have this right now. You should receive, we should review your documentation in 1 to 3 business days. So that's kind of the general guideline right now. I would say 2 business days is, like, if it's into the 3rd business day, it's probably worth asking or seeing if there's anything they can provide. But I don't know the exact timing of these right now. I don't know if Ivana has a better sense of that, but basically within 2 days, they should be looking at the ticket. And generally, if they're looking at the ticket within 2 days, I think they should be responding within 2 days.
Yes, Michael. So we track, there's a banner in sam.gov that you can check, and we track the average processing times. So depending on volumes, the longest I've seen it is 5 business days, but we have weeks where it's 1 business day, 3 business days on average.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's I'm looking at that right now in sam.gov. Oh, there's the review time link.
We update that every week.
Okay, awesome.
I've got one more question on the content before we get to the questions related to validation itself.
Okay.
And the question is, if the information is not correct, does the company keep the same incident number? And is there a time frame in which the company must complete the SAM registration?
Let's see. So if the entity comes into SAM and they open an EVS ticket because there was some problem with their information, the agent publishes an update, and then that SAM user goes back in and still sees a problem with that information. And if they say no to one of those pieces of information and then they provide again what it should be, that process updates the same ticket that they initially opened. So if they're within that 5-day review, that same ticket is still open. The status isn't literally open, but that's the sense is the ticket is still active. It's only if they go through and accept all the changes and say everything looks good, then if they then realize there's a problem after that, they'll end up opening a new ticket. Or if they don't come back and make that review within the 5 days from when the EVS agent published the changes, then the ticket closes. And then if there's anything wrong after that, they would create a new ticket. So as long as they're within that window, and there could be 2 or 3 loops of back and forth with the agent where they could be requesting updates and going back and forth. I wouldn't say that's common, but that's certainly possible in this scenario, and it stays under the same ticket. So hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, great. How long does the entity have to respond before the action is closed? And is there a way to get it reopened to respond to it if it's after that time?
I might defer to Ivana on one part of that. So the ticket status is going to change if they don't respond within 5 days. The part I'm not 100% sure on is if the user goes into FSD and comments directly on the ticket, if that's going to move it back to in progress. There's a final state of the ticket being, I think, closed versus resolved, where they can't reopen it. But I think it can go to resolved, and maybe it can be moved back to in progress by a user commenting on it. But
yeah, so it once it's resolved, in the new process, you have the option to confirm it. So it's not resolved until after you confirm. But if your ticket is resolved, it's not closed yet. So if you respond within 5 business days in the ticket, that reopens the ticket, puts it back in progress. It's just if you don't respond at all to the agent within those 5 business days, the ticket ends up closed and then you can't do anything. But this new process is kind of helping with that, because if an update was made, it doesn't resolve anymore. It stays on hold and gives you some time to confirm the details. Hopefully that answered it.
There is one more quick question. Once the ticket's updated in SAM, do they also have to go to fsd.gov?
I don't think they would ever absolutely have to go to FSD, because the user gets an email. That email has a link to SAM, to a specific URL with the ticket number in it, that's going to take them directly to this this workflow to let them review and accept those changes. So if they navigate to that URL, sign in, go through the confirm steps, and complete validation, and they either finish what they're doing, they get a UEI assigned, they go on to update their registration, or they got the UEI and they're done. If that's all they needed, they don't need to go to FSD for anything.
Okay, great. And can you confirm that the supporting and acceptable documentation list for validation is not impacted by this change?
Yeah, that's correct. So the answer is no. Will the supporting / acceptable document list be changing after July 19th? No, the documentation requirements aren't impacted by this change. It's just how the user interacts with requesting those changes.
All right, and we have a few questions. I know we're just about at time, but we had several questions related specifically to the DBA field. So a few users have indicated that they've got issues trying to remove the DBA. And I don't know, Michael, if that's one you can address or if that's more of an Ivana thing.
That's a good question. I see you still got 5 minutes left. I'm trying to confirm that now.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think that's something we've heard from before, where if you don't have a DBA and you want to add one, that's not a problem. But if there's one displaying and you want to remove it, I think maybe there wasn't a clear indication of, what does it mean to remove it and how do I do that?
Okay, we've got on our working document, Michael, we got several questions related to that.
Okay.
I'm thinking the next step is to confirm whether or not it's an issue, and if it is an issue, see if we can get it scheduled. If I'm not speaking out of school here.
No, I think that's fair. If it's especially if there's multiple questions about it, that's something that sounds like it needs to be addressed.
And another question real quick, does the list of acceptable documents to verify the entity address take into account foreign entities? I think Ivana can address that one.
Yeah, so the list of acceptable documents should, the one I recommend is called Can I Use This Document? That has, I know for a fact that that has a lot of documents that are also appropriate for non-US based entities. The challenge though can sometimes be translating what that document is in the other language. It may not be called the same thing that we call it here.
And kind of a follow-on question specific to validation documentation, Ivana, is will the user be required to know the date of incorporation to complete the process? If they don't know this, what else can they submit or use?
So I'm going to use the answer that you use a lot, Salome. It depends. So if it's a corporation, you're going to be required to validate a start year of incorporation. For other entities like sole proprietors, if your entity is already registered and the data source that we have doesn't have a start year, you probably won't even be required to provide it. But if the data source does have a year of incorporation, after you go through the update, if you need to change that year that we show for you, it's going to ask you for documents to support it. And so usually for a sole proprietor, unless you're registered with the state, our entity validation source won't require it or won't have one. But in cases where you're registered with the state, it's going to have a start year, and you would have to validate it if you were making changes to it. And documents that would be used, like the common one, I think, would be like an IRS filing where you list when, the IRS asks you when you file, when did you start operating this business? I think it's on the Schedule C.
And then for things like municipalities or state or local government, they can use any legislation that brought them into existence, correct?
Yes, and we did have question about some municipalities that were established like 100 years ago and might not have any documents at all. And so, what we recommend in those cases is provide what you have and then explain the situation. With state and local governments, we have a little bit more leeway. So, the entity validation service will offer alternatives.
Awesome. And we're just about at time. Michael, did you have any parting thoughts?
Only a question for you is how can participants here today let us know if there's something that is either good or bad, or something they want to give us an opinion on about these changes once they're in? Is there a good way for them to communicate that back to us?
One way I always recommend is the feedback button that's at the bottom of every page on sam.gov. We parse those and go through them every night. We also get the link of the page that an individual is on when that feedback button is selected, so we have the context. As far as the specific change goes, any feedback that you want to propose? Ivana, should we give them SAM testing?
We actually have a SAM training at gsa.gov.
Okay.
You want to use that one?
Yeah, let's use that one. If you've got specific feedback on this particular change when it's implemented the night of the 19th, so it would be the next business week, then I would go ahead and send that to SAM training, all one word, at gsa.gov. And Ivana and I will keep an eye open for those.
Awesome, thanks. That's all I had.
All right, well, thanks everyone for coming. We ran a minute over, but everyone have a great week, and thank you so much for your time and for your questions. And we hope this was helpful. Have a great day.